There's no such thing as a nice rich kid. That is the tagline for To Have and to Have More by Sanibel, a novel described as sad rich girl satire about hyper-privileged boarding school kids and their consequence-free lives. Sanibel's essays have been published in New York Magazine, ELLE, and Airmail. Her debut novel, To Have and to Have More, will be published by Eighth Note Press in the fall-winter of 2024. Is that right?
April 25.
April 25. Excuse me. She lives in Greenwich Village and is currently working on a satirical reimagining of the Odyssey from Athena's point of view, which I'm thrilled to talk about. I discovered her work through biting social critiques she posts as Instagram Reels. She's an expert in the art of BookTok and is leading a workshop next month on using TikTok as an author platform and book promotion tool. Welcome to Notes from a Ghost, a podcast about stories and the people who tell them. My name is Charlie, and I'm a ghostwriter. I love a good story. I hope you enjoy this one. Sanibel, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Charlie.
You and I grew up kind of like across the water from each other, apparently. I spent a lot of time in Chatham at the elbow of Cape Cod, and you were on Nantucket. And
seasonally. I mostly grew up in Princeton.
Yeah. Okay.
I feel like that's an important distinction.
Absolutely. It certainly is for Islanders. And so, I mean, you and I both, and we talked about this before we got started, we kind of grew up around and maybe were ourselves rich kids to some extent. What's the deal with rich kids? Why are they so simultaneously frustrating, interesting, misunderstood, etc.?
They are constant sources of fascination. I think there's a lot of polarizing opinions, but like you said, I think I would identify as maybe an ex-rich kid. But I think when you're young, you don't necessarily think about it the same way that you are capable of reflecting on when you're older. But in my book, since it is my first book, To Have and to Have More, is a satire. So I very much skewer these rich kids, and I feel like the things that are funny about rich kids when you're that age, when you're a teenager, they're darker when you get older. And one of the things that fascinates me most is like when you can't get out of your own way, and rich kids that are like deeply unhappy despite having so many privileges. And the way I refer to this is like the gilded cage, because you're the one who has the key, but you can't let yourself out. Like you could walk away, but I think like the challenge is when you have things that everyone else is striving for and you're constantly being told like you were born into what other people want so desperately, it's very hard to free yourself.
Yeah, it's and what are some ways of getting out? I mean, for me, and this has come up before on the podcast, I for whatever reason, like comfort didn't really agree with me. I don't like brunch. I don't like amenities, and so I've always gravitated towards being outside and doing things that are like physically challenging. And if I'm honest, things that I would have less access to if I had grown up without, home on both sides of the Atlantic, and some things that were the spoils of wealth and privilege. And I've met other like quote unquote rich kids like that, where they seek out adversity or what have you. Are there any other ways out of that gilded cage phenomenon?
Okay, well, the first thing that you made me think of was when I went to tennis camp, because of course I went to tennis camp. They told this parable every single summer, and it was like, this guy dies, he goes to the afterlife, he gets to play tennis every day, and he's crushing, he's winning every single match, he's winning in the round robin, he's like winning every single tournament there is. And then he says like, oh, heaven sure is swell. And then everyone looks at him and they're like, this is not heaven, this is hell. And then he realizes that like winning without trying is actually like the worst thing you could imagine. And I feel like this didn't make sense to me when I was at tennis camp, because they were trying to teach us like, don't be sore losers. But it actually makes more sense to me in the context of like gilded cage and like rich kid grievance. And I think I don't have the same spirit of adventure as you, but I think what like ultimately pushed me to, it's not like you renounce that life. I think it's like you just want something different, and conformity is so valued in like that status society brunch, whatever you want to call that. And just like, I think wanting to be a writer was divergent enough that it like made my family angry. And that was not something that was really supported. And when I was in my MFA, which I was lucky to go to, there was like this tacit understanding that I would get an MBA afterwards, which I really did not want to do and ultimately didn't. But I think just the like sticking to your guns is really hard when there's like generational wealth that can control you. Like, don't you want help with a down payment on your house? Don't you want someone to pay for your wedding? Like all those things that are like dangled in front of you, you have to like say no to them.
Hmm. And it seems like in the, you know, in the long, like if we zoom out, and I know you and I are going to get into the Odyssey later, which I'm like so excited to talk about. But, you know, if you look at like the long arc of like stories and myths, renouncing or somehow turning wealth and privilege and status towards a kind of a higher purpose or a something that, you know, finding a way to seek something that isn't handed to you seems to have like a long established tradition in like what we had. Because the other thing too, like I feel like rich kids are really obnoxious and it's really easy to like resent people who are handed things, but we really admire people who are doing something good with or who have like done something original or I don't know. We all know who Lord Byron is. Like, name another lord from that era. Well,
you know, I mean, it's interesting you say that because I do feel like we love a rags to riches story, right? Like in American literature, but I feel like low key, what we actually like better is like riches to rags to back to riches, where there's rules and there's justice, and like if you manage to like gain those riches at one point and lose them, like there's a path for you to like get back on the right track. And like the first thing that comes to mind is sort of like Clueless, because like she's popular and then she like Frankenstein's this friend by accident who like exceeds her, but then by the end of the movie she's like firmly back on top and like everything's good then, and that is a happy ending. But then I think of like one of the titles I really wanted to use for my book, but it was like absolutely turned down, was Princess Hal, because I love the like Shakespeare character who kind of like cosplays poor, and he is like this prince, but he likes to slum it like at like the tavern, and he has like that Falstaff character as his mentor. But it's like when push comes to shove, he like does the right thing and renounces his like ways and takes the throne in the way that he's supposed to and is responsible. And like to me that's kind of heartbreaking though, because it's like there's a lot of like self-abnegation involved, and like that's in my mind like that's the crux of To Have and Have More, where it's like, yes, these are very much first world problems and we're talking about like, oh my gosh, it's so hard to like walk away from brunch life. But I think like the psychological trauma that happens in your head when you are that rich kid, like it goes pretty deep. And like where I really see this is what I do to pay the bills is I help kids write their college essays, and most of my clients are prep school kids. And so I like every single year I have a front row seat to this. And for the past 5 years, I've only kind of seen it getting worse, where like, yes, like your parents will pay for tutors of all sorts and they'll make donations to get you into this Ivy League that you want to go to. But like you have absolutely no autonomy over your own life, and everything is kind of like laid out and you're just following these steps in a preordained life. And like, I think that's so sad.
Well, and like there's your tennis hell of winning without trying.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. Now your title, I'm a little rusty on my like Lost Generation short stories, but is that Hemingway? The Have and Have Not?
To Have and Have, yeah, that's I don't think that thematically it's all that related. I read that book in high school. The character is like a prohibition rum runner. Like he goes to Cuba, like back and forth, bringing rum into the States. And like, I honestly don't think there's all that much overlap, but I was like, this is a nice title. And since they didn't like Princess Hal, people, my agent, my editor were like much more on board with to have more.
And there's like an iconic exchange that kind of speaks to a lot of your themes between Fitzgerald of Princeton and Hemingway, where Fitzgerald, who obviously was a big fan of like the social commentary, and Hemingway less so, he said, like, you know, the thing about rich people, Hemingway, is that they're not like, they're different from you and me or something like that. And then Hemingway's reply was, yeah, they have more money.
Mm-hmm.
Who's right there? Are they both right?
I think like when I was in high school, like my absolute favorite writer was Fitzgerald, and like it pains me to say this, and I don't want to sound pretentious, but it's like I feel like I outgrew that because that interaction just showcases so much how Fitzgerald was just like deeply obsessed with status without any irony. And I feel like he died really young, but he never outgrew that. So there was always like this fascination and kind of halo around the rich for him that like gave us Gatsby, which is one of my favorite reference. But I think there's also like when you revere something too much, you can't get the right perspective on it. So like my favorite character in Gatsby is Daisy Buchanan. And like I've described my book before as like my character is like a modern day Daisy Buchanan. Like if the book was about her, what's her interiority like? But I think that Hemingway, it's not that I agree with him. He swings so far like to the opposite side of the spectrum, but I think they're both extremes to the point of like being caricatures.
Yeah, it's I've often thought that about, you know, like, and I remember watching because I was obsessed with Hemingway when I was in college, you know, as you do, and then of course like Raymond Carver, where it's like the 2.0 version. But watching that PBS Ken Burns thing, I remember thinking, like, what if this guy had grown up in a time where it was okay for men to, like, admit that they have feelings? Like, he probably would have written such better stuff.
No, it's funny you say that that was, like, your high school, your college fascination, because it is such, like, a trope that, like, young men love Hemingway. And, like, in my MFA, it was, like, eye-rolly when men would be like, oh, I love David Foster Wallace. Like, these are all just, like, cliches on your writer journey of like what stages do you go through. It's like teenagers like falling in love with Nirvana. Every single generation has that experience. And it's funny because it's like, yeah, he is sort of emblematic of like a certain type of toxic masculinity, but I feel like there are some stories where he like shows an opposite side and like it almost makes it all that much more impactful.
Yeah, and I think she's an Irish writer, I should know this. I think it was Maeve Binchy was in that documentary, and she was like, you can't say that he doesn't get it.
Right. It's like a willful suppression, though.
Yes.
It's like there's like a deeper sensitivity there, but it's like this you have to get at it subtextually almost.
So I wanted to, and like when I first discovered your stuff on Instagram, the question I knew you would be really like the perfect person to answer came up with a young kind of getting started ghostwriter I was talking to recently. And I was going back to like advice I had been given when I was getting started. And somebody told me something that really jumped out at me as kind of different. It wasn't writing advice. It wasn't career advice. It wasn't about getting an agent. And they said, you know, you're going to be getting paid, like, you know, to hire a ghostwriter costs anywhere from $50,000 to $150,000 once you're doing it professionally. And you need to understand the psychology of someone for whom that is not very much money at all, and someone who isn't motivated by saving money. That this is in the same category as buying art. They would rather pay more if they could, because it would mean they're getting better art or something. And they were really like emphatic. They're like, until you get that, you are going to be underpaid. And because for I think most people, but especially writers, especially English majors, that's a lot of money. Like certainly a lot of money for me. I don't know how to like talk casually about figures like that. And so what would be your advice for ghostwriters for navigating that dynamic in a graceful, thoughtful way?
Okay, I thought about this beforehand because you let me know this was going to be up. And okay, the thing I would need to know before like answering this is like what are the typical pitfalls, or like what patterns have you found to be challenging? Like is it that they have fragile egos, or they're very demanding? Like what are the difficulties?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one that would probably be almost a no, like it's the red flag I'm looking for in our first conversation. And this has come up on this podcast before. Like, do you have just very unrealistic ideas about what a book could do for you? If you want me to write your book, that's kind of my first question is like, what are your goals? Because, to have something, I do a lot of speaking engagements and I want people to be able to buy a book, or I want to access, that's a great reason to write a book. Leaving a legacy for your kids, awesome. Establishing yourself as the person who wrote the book about the thing you are an expert. That is such a, like, you should totally do the BookTok book. Like, that would be perfect. Where the red flag is sell 1 million copies. I mean, besides the fact that that's unrealistic, it shows me you don't even know what bestseller status means by the numbers. Get this made into a movie. I mean, I've had people tell me who they think would be a good fit to play them in a movie. Stuff like that.
Wow,
where
that's
you're just
bold.
yeah, and it's like
Okay.
Like things, and again, like these aren't, and I might still work with someone like this, but we really need to have an honest conversation about like what is possible, because I'm going to be to blame when that doesn't happen and Cillian Murphy doesn't play you. And so like, so there's that. I think that sometimes though this never has anything to do with how much the person could spend. And so, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but those are some of the big red flags that might come up in that early stage.
Right. Okay. No, I see what you're asking, because, okay, so about navigating this dynamic gracefully, right? Like that's sort of the question. And okay, on one hand, I want to be like, rich people are not a monolith. There's a ton of diversity within rich people.
Yes.
Like there are very understanding, generous ones, and then there are like demanding people with unrealistic expectations. So what you're talking about and setting expectations does remind me of like when I've honed this over the years after some bad conversations with parents of kids whose essays I'm helping with. Like I'm very clear from the get-go, like I'm not ghostwriting your essay. I'm not guaranteeing any kind of admissions result. And like I have to work with the raw material that the student gives me. So like it's not going to sound like a professional writer wrote it at the end, probably. And like, yeah, so I think definitely setting expectations at the beginning is smart. Then you're asking about like the psychology of someone who 150K doesn't mean anything to them. I feel like that though, like you have to, and if you're writing a biography, maybe you learn like the details about their life and their upbringing, but like the psychology of someone who comes from generational wealth, I feel like is actually quite different than someone who is self-made. And the way that they interact with you, like in the consultation when you're first talking to them about the project, people wear their insecurities on their sleeves so much. You can probably already tell like what's going to be like a touchy subject for them. And if they're, like I said, writing a bio, then how are you going to like navigate that when you have to talk about it? And so like when I think about navigating like a demanding client gracefully, I think it's sort of like, what level of truth are they demanding from you? Do they just want you to like do the job the way they're asking, or do they want you to write a good book? Because those are like two very different things. Because like if I'm working with a student and we have an essay that I think is strong, like this will hopefully get you into the reach school that you're applying to, but then the parent comes in and says like, oh, we need to change all these things. Like I make a decision, like, should I explain to this parent like what I'm doing, or are they the type of person who I should just say, okay, but know that I think this draft is better, but we'll go with yours. Like it's such like a social maneuvering more so than like a business interaction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you end up, I call it sometimes like unlicensed therapy. I mean, you end up in this weird place where you're a sounding board for all kinds of things. And I guess when it comes to the conversation around money, you can sort of learn a lot by how somebody talks about it. I've had clients where they're writing this off as a marketing expense. They have no problem talking about money, and it's not even their money, or like they're looking to an advance from a publisher, and so we're kind of on the same side of the table in that regard. That makes a lot of sense. Like using that as a vehicle or a springboard to understand kind of what they want in a deeper level. Sounds like what you're saying, and what their dream for the book is, but while handling that gentle ego at the same time.
Right. And I guess for ghostwriting, does it work that you charge like one lump sum?
It depends. So typically I would have like a sort of a down payment at the beginning of the project, and then but if it's through an agent, oftentimes that's like paid in halves, like when you start and when you finish. It just depends.
Okay, because I bill by the hour, and like over the years, I've upped my rate every season. And like when I think about like how am I deciding my rate, it's sort of like if I go over that hour and it's like an hour 10, an hour 15, I don't want to feel, because it's like bad service to look like, okay, we've got to cut it here. This is all the time you paid for. Like you're kind of providing like almost like a luxury service. And so like you don't want to seem like it's about the money. So it's like I need to charge enough that if this runs 15 minutes over, I'm fine with that. And I feel like ghostwriting, like it could go on forever. Like what if you have a really demanding client that like wants rewrites and rewrites and rewrites? Like at a certain point you want to be able to say, like, okay, we have to charge you more money because this is taking up a lot more time than I anticipated.
Oh yeah. Well, where I have found that conversation is really important is around word counts, because unless you actually write either professionally or as a hobby, you don't know like how many pages that translates to, how long it takes to produce 1,000 words or 10,000. And yeah, I mean, I haven't been in too many of these situations, but I know of projects or I've been pitched projects where it's like, well, I thought, I have 50,000, I think it's going to be somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 words. And it's like, so you either want me to write a book or 2 books is basically what you're saying. Like,
that's so fun. Yeah. And I'm sure it's a challenge when you're working with someone who doesn't know anything about like publishing or like genre or word count or what constitutes a bestseller. Like that is kind of a crash course that you have to give along the way also, in addition to ghostwriting the book.
Oh yeah, totally. And including like tending to the emotional roller coaster and the rejection that goes with like getting a book published.
Like you said, it's therapy. Yeah. Like, and that's why like with my essay consulting, I try to be like very hardline that like I'm not your college counselor. I'm not going to help you like figure out what schools are a good fit. Like I try to make it as like tangible as possible. Like I'm providing the service, and at the end you get an essay. Whereas like one of the jobs that I had during the pandemic was like general college consulting, and these parents and students, like they want you to be on call 24/7 because they feel like that's like the service they're paying for. Like they just get you all the time, and like they have an emergency because the kid thought they wanted to go here and now they've changed their mind, and like that is on me to like answer the phone and like take that phone call in the middle of dinner. And, like that was just such like a ludicrous business, but it especially in Manhattan, it's really thriving. Like people pay for this. Is actually a character in my book that's based on like an article that I read where people will hire a essay counselor for their kid, and then they will live in your guest house like for the summer between junior and senior year, and like they will only work with your kid, and like it's just full essay mode all summer. And like this is not even that uncommon with like private school, prep school kids these days. So I was like, this is a good character. So I have that in my book. Mm-hmm.
That's wild. Well, so I actually I want to kind of briefly get it, because I mean people can find you and work with you on college essays, but if you I'd love to know some of your kind of general advice there, because I'm sure someone listening is probably either going through that or their kids are. And there was one thing on your website that really jumped out at me, and that was that the like there is nothing worse than being forgettable in your essay.
Okay, I mean, like make sure that you understand I'm talking about college essays here, specifically like the personal essay. Like I teach one-on-one, and like so since everything is a private lesson, like it's so tailored to that kid that sometimes I honestly worry like I'm not making them better writers. Like we are just perfecting this one essay. I don't necessarily feel like they're walking away like understanding the mechanics of an essay. And if I like say I were teaching a group, then it would be more like abstract. I would be explaining concepts of like this is how you write a transition or whatever it may be. But since like it is this luxury of one-on-one tutoring, like we have a single goal and like we can afford to be narrow-minded about it. But like the first thing I tell kids when we like meet for that first session, I take a lot of the burden off of them, because no matter what, no matter how much I say like let's start early, like we get down to the deadline and it's like crunch time. But I have to learn their voice, and like I'm sure you do this all the time as a ghostwriter. Like when I'm interviewing at the beginning and like we're thinking of a topic and they're just telling me about their life and anecdotes, it's really like only half about the content and more about me getting a feel for how they sound and like the way that they talk, so that I can like put that in the style and the voice of the essay and make sure it doesn't come out anonymous. Because when students are in English class throughout high school, you're learning how to write like book reports and analytical essays, and they never write a single personal essay until this like terribly crucial time. So like the entire art of personal essay is brand new to them. And I'll assign some kids like Fran Lebowitz essays, or like I try to find things that are like short and pithy, but 650 words is no one writes that. It's either like way too long or it's flash fiction. So like that sweet spot is kind of hard to communicate to kids. And I'll be like, maybe read some David Sedaris, or like these funny essays where it's like understand how voice works, because that's a new concept to them. But like when I'm explaining the phenomenon of a personal essay, a lot of it is just unteaching English class essay. And like that's sort of the first thing I need to do. It's like whatever you've been taught in English class, you have to kind of compartmentalize that, because unlike all those essays where you're not allowed to say I, you're not allowed to use first person, the entire point of this essay is I statements. And that like sometimes I like cannot get that through to the student. It never fully lands.
Oh man, God, it's a tough one. I feel, and it's weird because I feel like I wasn't a very good student, and I didn't pursue education beyond college, and even then I didn't apply myself very much in college. But like there were still things that I had to unlearn that were the product of learning how to pass certain classes that like left a nasty residue in my writing. There's one thing that I think you could probably speak to from your in a lot of the kind of themes you talk about, but also this work on these essays. I bet it comes up in college essays, and I don't even know what you'd call this, but it's like a likability paradox. And I talk about this with authors all the time, and it tell me if this rings true. Like, I think telling a story to try to make yourself sound likable, whether that's like virtue signaling, or I did this great thing, or here I am saving the day, will make you unlikable to readers. And revealing something unlikable about yourself in a honest, vulnerable way will make you likable.
I feel like this is like college essay 101 almost. No, absolutely. It's like no one likes a bragger, but humble bragging is okay if you can do it elegantly. I think it actually plays really well in a project like a college essay that has like an agenda. And I have a feeling a lot of your ghost written books have an agenda also.
Big time.
Like being vulnerable and admitting to like small transgressions, I think actually makes you like very likable. And do you ever read Tobias Wolff?
Probably in one of those like mammographed, like printed The short answer is no. Remember getting like handed those like printed short stories in college?
Like he is sort of like my like beacon for that vulnerable, unlikable person, where like they are making the short story that I read a couple weeks ago was like this guy is hitchhiking and he's supposed to be getting gas because his wife and his young baby are stranded at the gas station, and he's hitchhiking to go somewhere else to like get supplies, and he gets in this car with these people and they're like, come with us, we're going to a party, and he's made the decision to abandon his family. Like he decides in that car like screw it, I can't handle this anymore. But then like the people in the car like do or say something that offends him, or like they get rowdy and he like wants out. But it's like in his heart he's already made the decision to abandon his family, even though he's going back. And like, you know this about him, and it's always like these really deeply flawed characters, but like you feel for them, and he manages to make them sympathetic even though they're often like bad / complex people. And it's like so much more interesting than reading a story about someone who just like always does the right thing and doesn't feel real or human.
Makes a lot of sense. And when you think about, because your agenda is such a loaded word sometimes, but if your agenda is you want to help people with what you wrote, oftentimes it's those flaws that are going to get through to someone who's kind of broken in exactly the same way.
No, absolutely.
Or is going through
I do
the same
think that
thing.
like likability in writing is extremely hard to teach. Like because it's like it's subtext and it's connotation, and does the person you're working with have a good vocabulary? Like that's the thing I find the most difficult, honestly, working with high school students. It's like, okay, I know what I want to say, but I have to kind of dilute it because they wouldn't use that word. That sounds very stilted coming out of a 18-year-old's mouth. And it's like you kind of like lose this entire layer of language because it has to sound convincing, and they don't yet have like a rich enough vocabulary to really communicate like a sophisticated take on a simple idea. And like I think that's also the hardest thing about like the essays. It's like you have to say something that's almost contrived. Like it's like, and then I realized that like life is short and you have to like maximize your time on earth, right? It's always something like really cliched, but you have to like frame it in a new sophisticated way. And like that's my challenge every year, where it's like the same 5 stories repackaged. And like if they don't come up with the idea and I'm already kind of feeding them the idea, then it's even harder for them to like wrap it in language. So it's like it's like too much to ask for a student who's never written a personal essay before.
Yeah, and I mean, on top of that, these poor kids, like they're going through such a stressful time. There's so much pressure. They're being told that their future, even the possibility of having a future, will depend on this 650-word statement. And I'm wondering, like, because one thing I encounter, and I've never had this not happen, whether it's with a podcast guest or someone I'm writing for, that I think everyone's interesting, but we all vary in like how we can express what's interesting about ourselves. And I'm wondering, and oftentimes like it really takes a while, and then you get to something where this person maybe didn't even really think that biographical fact or whatever mattered, but it's actually kind of the most interesting thing about them. I would imagine that happens with these essays all the time, where there's some nugget.
I mean, I feel like you're saying like don't bury the lead on yourself, but it's hard to sometimes suss out, because you have to see yourself from a third person perspective though. Or it's like people have a hard time, like honestly, more than the college essays, what I'm thinking right now is about like when I'm making content. And this has been a 6-month learning curve for me. Like I hadn't posted anything on social media since 2015 before this year. And so like I consumed it, but I never posted anything. And it's very different to actually make content. And when I'm making the videos, sometimes like when I write my script, I realize that it's boring and you have to like start from scratch and come up with a different angle. And it's like, I think when people are telling their own stories, the narrative of self is like, it's changeable and you can like update it, but it's pretty fixed in a way. And like when someone's telling their story to the ghostwriter, it probably feels like, okay, and these things just happen in this order and I'm explaining my motivations, but like someone else has to come in and say, actually, like the thing that will sell this story is like the piece that you said in offhand remark. And so like this honestly makes me think of an essay I wrote with a girl who like she was like, I don't even know why I'm telling you this, but when I was in the Starbucks line today in the drive-thru, like someone like paid it forward for me. And when I got up to the window, they said, oh, your drink is paid for. And then they said, do you want to pay for the person behind you? And she was like, no. And then she left. And like I thought that was such like a funny thing for her to share. And like she was not a callous kid. Like it was just like she didn't feel like it and she left, and that was just like a frank moment. But when she told it to me, like I was like, there's a way that this can play well. Like you admitting that you did this and you felt kind of guilty afterwards, like that's going to be our opening anecdote because it's like a little bit vulnerable and what you did is like bad, but not that bad. It's like it's got to be like the right level of vulnerable. And I thought that was perfect. So it's kind of like this. And often I feel like it's in those anecdotes where kids say to me like, this is not going to be relevant at all. And then they share something about their life. And I'm like, that's actually the most relevant stuff. It's really hard for non-writers to figure out like what's interesting about themselves.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I guess it's because, do you think it's just because they don't walk around with like narrative in their head and trying to, I mean, like people tell stories for all sorts of reasons, but I mean, they're not in the business of finding stories like you and I are.
Right. Like I always think in like symbols and motifs, like even in real life, like when I see something, I'm like, oh, that feels like it's tied to something that's happening in my life, or like real life themes and through lines. And like even in this interview, like I'm trying to answer somewhat in anecdotes because I know that it's really difficult to understand someone's like abstract train of thought. And it's much easier if you couch it in an anecdote, even if the anecdote is like adjacent and not exactly what you're trying to say, but it's like, it's the reason people like sci-fi, but they don't read philosophy.
I love that.
It's like, yeah, I mean, the thing that I heard was like, sci-fi is philosophy for dumb people. I was like, that's good.
Yeah, it's really and going back to like client relationships, and I've described myself as like semi-illiterate, which is like objectively not true. But I feel that way sometimes, and I don't really think I'm that smart. And I'll find myself saying that like on calls with clients and stuff. But it can kind of work in your favor when then all of a sudden you come up with a really brilliant turn of phrase or whatever when you've been prepping this person for how like kind of what a dummy you are.
Driving reminds me of like I took one marketing class when I was in college, and the like my main takeaway was the slogan like under promise and over deliver. Right? Like that will always make you look really good. So that's basically what you're doing in a way. I think it's like we are suspicious of people who seem like they're overcompensating for something. And I like in a way this is sort of like a typical like rich guy profile where like they're throwing their weight around. They want to seem like they're like really confident, but you can tell like it's masking some insecurity that is like right under the surface. And like when I was I took a GMAT class when I was studying for business school ostensibly, and like I befriended this guy in my class, and he was talking about himself, and he was one of these people who like had a transformation, and they're really insistent on like hating their old self. And I'm always like sort of suspicious of these people because it's like that's still you to some degree, and like that is like weirdly self-loathing. But he was like, when you look at me, like what do you see? And I was like, what is this question? He's like, like a quality. It starts with C. And then I was like, and then he was like, confident. And I was like, someone who is telling you like I'm confident.
Oh boy,
self-esteem issues. And I just nodded along though. It's like this person needs to tell themselves I'm confident to like kind of get into that mode. And that must be so difficult. So it's like if you're like going to a potential client and you're insisting that like you're the best and you're so great and like you need to be hired, like I think that immediately makes people's like antenna go up and question like why is this such a hard sell? No one likes a hard sell.
Yeah, no, and I mean, and it's weird again, and maybe this is back to my original question about the ticket, or the sticker price of ghostwriting, and that is it kind of like a lot of sort of nice to haves. It is a very emotional decision. I have never sold some. I don't even like that word, but I've never convinced someone to work with me on the basis of like my selling points or resume. It's always been a emotional fit. Yeah, I don't know. And just clicking, I guess.
It's funny you say that, right? Because on one hand, like you said before, like a lot of people who hire this service, like money's no object. So it really is just like, do I have chemistry with this person? And like in that, like whatever, like 5 seconds or whatever, when you make the snap judgment about someone, like is the impression correct? And like the thing that I thought is so funny is I've gotten a lot of essay clients through TikTok, and I feel like my TikTok persona is a little bit off-putting. And it's funny to me that like parents, or like it's mostly parents that reach out to me. Like a huge part of my demographic is like moms. Like I can pretty much tell that from like my stats. And they see these videos and they reach out to me like, will you work with my kid? And it's just like so funny to me because I didn't make any of those videos to sell my services. Like I never even plugged, like I'm a consultant. I'm just kind of like riffing. Those were sort of my first experimental videos where it's easier to teach something concrete when you're like figuring out how to make content than to talk about like abstract subjects or do a video essay. But like from those videos, it was this like unexpected windfall that I got like more clients than I had to turn people away. I got more than I've ever had in the past. And it was just funny to see that like it's almost like a little bit arrogant because I'm telling you like this is a good topic and this is a bad topic and like I'm the authority on this, and like that people gravitated towards that. But maybe I'm just like, I would never hire someone off TikTok. To me, that already feels sus to begin with. But I like the marketplace is changing so much, and like parents are hiring me without even doing consults, and I'm like, okay, well, luckily I feel that I'm good at what I do and I like am providing a legitimate service, but like where's the vetting process? Like my mom would be like making 10 calls and making sure like, and where'd you go to school? Like she's very into pedigree. And I was like, people didn't really ask me any questions. They were just like, do you have space? Can you take on my kid?
I kind of love that. Like it's just one of those things. I mean, in a way, it is more meritocratic. Is that the adjectival?
That's what I always
term?
say about TikTok, especially as opposed to Instagram. Like on TikTok, you can have 0 followers, but if you make a video that like keeps getting served, like it will circulate. But then the downside of that is like, okay, I built a little bit of a following and I think this video is going to do really well. And then you see that it performs really badly. Like you kind of start from scratch each time. So like every video has a chance, but you don't really get rewarded for like having a hit.
Yeah, so I want to get into that because I know you're actually about to launch a workshop to teach people how to use TikTok. I'm not on there. I met you through Instagram, and before we get into that real quick, there was one other little paradox in something you said about like people's confidence that it's kind of like, and this is the piece of concrete advice I like to give people who are writing their own book, the big words paradox. Using plain, direct language will make you sound smart. Using big words will make you sound like you're trying to sound smart.
SAT words will kill you. Like magnanimous. Students love magnanimous. I'm like, we're not allowed to say magnanimous, and we're not allowed to say epiphany.
Oh my gosh.
Like certain words that get overused, or I mean, it's like people have a very high sensitivity for falsity. So if you sense that someone's putting on airs, whether they're trying to sound smart or they're trying to act rich or whatever it is, like you just immediately kind of shrink away from them because they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes. And it's like, I'm not going to be like swindled. Like, I'm not going to be socially swindled. I'm not going to be morally swindled. I'm not going to like actual money swindled. Like, I think it's just such a like repellent thing that you learn to avoid because everyone's been burned at some point.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that goes to like vibe fit. And again, I don't mean to say that like because that's been how I've gotten clients in the past. I'm not saying I click with everyone. I'm definitely not everyone's idea of who they want to write their book, but like the people I have worked with, that's why. And I think the hard sell kind of doesn't work for the reason you're describing.
I definitely don't click with everyone also. Someone in my comments, like I think it was a mom, wrote, "You're so condescending. Why would I even want my kid to work with you?" And then like a stranger defended me though, and it was kind of nice. And they were like, "Who says that she would work with your kid?" It's just like, when strangers are having an argument in your comments, I'm like, okay, this is a good sign.
That's great.
You can't appeal to everybody.
No, and trying to will actually alienate you from people who like what you're doing.
Absolutely. It's kind of like with editing. It's like if you get the opinions of too many of your like writer friends, then you start like editing to a generic version of your story, and then it loses its personality.
Totally. Yeah. And I think why some of the best editors and beta readers, and maybe this was your experience on your book, are people who just kind of have good taste and they're not qualified in any special way.
Yeah, like my husband is my main beta reader, and he's not a writer, he's a filmmaker, but he just has good like storytelling instincts. And so that helps me more than like a professional writer who's like in line editing mode and reading on like a word level. Like sometimes it's just like this chapter was kind of slow, and like that helps me more than like change this word or like this character wouldn't do that.
Yes. Oh man. Yeah, no, that's true. Wait, so I want to get to BookTok. So the big kind of, and maybe this is, I had a project I was working on recently, and I learned something about asking questions, and how sometimes the question you think is a stupid question actually gets to part of the matter in a way that it's like that right kind of naive. And to me, the no stupid questions question about TikTok is, it seems to me that, reading long form, sitting down to like digest something, and these like little micro bursts of attention and that you have in it, they seem total opposites. And yet I've been told that TikTok is where it's at right now for promoting books. What's going on there? Is that observation?
I think everything you're saying
onto something?
Everything you're saying is accurate, but I think that a lot of people that buy books do not read them. So like maybe that's where the truth is that people love to collect books. And I've been seeing this sort of really annoying like sentiment where it's like, it's okay if you don't read all the books you buy. Like people need to be validated in this. And I'm like, we're at like such a low point of like the things that we're validating. And I'm like, if you're insecure that you bought too many books and you're not reading them, like that shouldn't need to be affirmed publicly. But like that's where we are.
Before we got on, we were trying to figure out sort of which reel because you were kind of like in my Explorer feed, and I think that's how I found your reels. Okay. And I remember now there's one where you were talking about reading as a luxury and how it basically isn't wanted. Yeah, and I didn't
to be provocative.
No. So I'm wondering, could we like revisit that real quick? It reminded me of have you read Books versus Cigarettes by George Orwell?
No.
Where I think it's like really short. It's like 250 words, but he basically breaks down the cost of reading by the hour compared to.
That's so funny.
And
okay.
And he's basically like, if you're thinking of it as a wealthy, frivolous pastime or a class distinction, you're totally wrong, because like it's cheaper than going to the movies, it's cheaper than smoking, it's cheaper than drinking.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a library person, so like reading is like eminently accessible in my mind. You don't need to. You also don't need to like read the hottest book right now. Like a lot of times, I get the book like 2 years because I've been on the wait list for 200 people, and it's like it's still the same book. You might like lag in conversation, but yeah, the reading is not a luxury. The sad thing is like, to me, that's not provocative at all. But I knew that if I posted it online, it is somewhat provocative. And it's because there's like a lot of coddling with people's status as readers. And like my husband and I talk about this a lot because I made a TikTok that I did not put on Reels because I felt it was too provocative about how like audiobooks are not reading, right? And like Reese Witherspoon is like huge in book influencing, and she like came out with a statement that was like, audiobooking is reading. Stop putting yourself down and saying, oh, I didn't read it, I audiobooked it. And she's done great things for publishing and especially like female writers. But I was like, this is just not factually true. Like listening is not the same as reading. And my arguments were like, when you read your 2-year-old a book out loud, you don't say that they can read. Like that's just simply not true, right? And I had a lot of like what I thought were completely airtight arguments about listening versus reading and being two different skills. But like people in the comments were irate. And like luckily that video didn't do like that well. So like it stayed small. Like I think my agent and my publisher were like, please don't get canceled before your book comes out. And I was like, you have to be pretty famous to get canceled. So I was like, don't worry. I only have like 6,000 followers on TikTok. But like when I sensed that the reactions to this audiobook controversy were such, I could anticipate like the reading is not a luxury might have the same reaction. But I think that as many people like that resisted and said like, no, it is a luxury. Like you have to have time. Like what if you're a mom? What if you work a full-time job plus part-time jobs? Like I think my main argument was like, everyone's online so much. You're watching this video and commenting on it. Like this is your time to read. But the thing that, sorry, this is what I'm jumping around. This is what I was saying that my husband and I talk about a lot. People like reader as an identity. Like for some reason, and I think it's getting even more like chic. Like there's so many like it girl celebrities, like literati adjacent, that are kind of using like I'm well read as a personality trait these days.
Yes,
People really like consider themselves readers. And I think one of the things I say in the reel is like, if you don't read, like no one's going to punish you. Like that's not something that is like expected of every person. Like if you want to be a reader, then read. Like it's that simple. But people like the aesthetic of reading. And like that's why these like bookstagram accounts kind of get on my nerves, where it's just like you see these books next to a mug of coffee or like a book held up in front of the ocean, and it's just like, did you read the book though? Like, do you have anything thoughtful to say about the book? But it's just like, I mean, it's like a late capitalist dystopian pitch practically.
What's the thing? There was a thing David Foster Wallace said of like his students where it was like, have you read Anna Karenina? And it's like, well, not personally.
Yeah, that's funny, right? It's like that's
the
how
tote bag.
feels.
It's the tote bag thing.
Yeah, people love the and like I'm not saying that I love David Spade. I think he's so funny, but he had on like the Paris Review T-shirt, and I'm like, oh, the Paris Review is like a good brand. And I find myself thinking like this, and I'm like thinking more in terms of like literature as a brand, and I'm like, how do I want to like position myself if I'm like selling this book that I want to be considered literary, but I actually want it to perform like a commercial book? And like this is what I'm thinking about as I'm making my content. I'm like, okay, which audience am I trying to reach with this video versus that one?
Yeah, it's really God, that's such a like I've kind of thrown out all the questions I had now, because that concept of not everyone's reading the books they buy is just I mean,
okay, but when I'm talking about like teaching this BookTok course, like I certainly by no means think of myself as a TikTok expert, and I actually am like very critical of all the like bad infrastructure of the publishing world that is basically preying on like desperate writers that are like one step behind you. It's like, I'm teaching a query letter writing class. I'm teaching you how to get an agent. And it's like, my book hasn't even sold. I feel like there's so much of this in publishing where it's like, it's hard to get your foot in the door, and everything is so gatekept that even if you have an agent, but you haven't sold your book, like that counts for something. And I've seen like, this was kind of outrageous to me, but this author that got an agent at WME put in their LinkedIn, like WME contracted author, like as if that were like a job that they held. And I was like, this really feels like a stretch. Like you're really and like when I look at people's Instagram bios, this is like one of I think it will come to as no surprise that I'm very judgmental, but like in people's Instagram bio, if they say who their rep is, if they like really want to like showcase like this is my agent, I find that more often than not that is like someone who hasn't sold their book yet. And like they really want some kind of like credibility or like something to hang their hat on. And so they'll be like, this is my agent. And it's like that agent has like 60 clients that they're responding to before that person. But it's like everything in publishing is like so rat racy at every stage. But with the BookTok class, like what I'm teaching is very specific to like authors that want to sell their book. I'm not teaching you how to like, because I have not managed to become like someone who's like monetized this and I'm making a living being a creator. I'm like, no, but I've managed to get decent free orders, which is like pretty difficult to do with a debut. And like what I'm teaching is also not just like me putzing around on TikTok. It's also like a lot of things that I learned in my journalism career, which is basically writing clickbait. And it intersects with like culture essays and then writing. Do you know what commerce journalism is? Like if you Google best toothbrush. Okay. And it's like Wirecutter, like 10 best toothbrushes. It's like I've spent so many hours of my life writing these articles where it's like it can't sound like ad copy. It has to sound like an authentic review. And it's like a very weird skill to develop. And I feel like this is like that thankfully like turned out not to be like a useless waste of my time because I use a lot of those like headline writing skills and everything in my TikToks because you're constantly trying to like engage people and entertain them and trick them into learning something. Like that's kind of how I think about it. I'm like, okay, what I really want to talk about in this video is affirmative action, but I know that no one's going to watch a video that starts with that. So instead, like I front loaded it with Mary-Kate and Ashley's like fashion show at the Paris Fashion Week. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna force you to watch those first 10 seconds and then I'm gonna get to what I actually want to watch. And it's like subversively educating you. And like that's the only way you can educate people these days, I feel like.
Oh yeah. You have to even like with memoir, it's what is it? There's this trifecta of like inspiring, entertaining, and informing or something.
Okay.
Educate, inspire, and entertain. And if you can do all three, you've written like an amazing memoir.
Yeah, that's a good trifecta. I do feel like the entertainment piece of it though is like getting bigger and bigger all the time.
Oh yeah. And so there are a couple of things that kind of came up just in what you were saying that really strike me as kind of perfect for the sort of analysis of because what I really like about your reels, your TikToks is you take a look at something that's going on in the world or that we've all seen or maybe that we have strong opinions about, and you're breaking down sort of maybe a facet of what's happening there or a way of looking at it. And it seems based on especially like the really needy, like I'm repped by this person, there's a lot of kind of like counter signaling and quiet luxury in the world of writing where there are things that don't necessarily come across as like super like flashy LinkedIn professional, but would actually indicate that you're the real deal.
I just did a reel about like Sally Rooney and how she doesn't want to be involved in promoting her book at all. And I was like, that is like true success. Like I aspire to that. And like, you know, when you see, like I look at so many writers' websites, when you have like that bare bones website that hardly has anything on it, like that's someone who's doing really well. And I'm like, I aspire to that one day where it's like no contact information, no nothing. So, like one of my favorite writers is Hallie Butler. She has like zero social media and I think I tried to reach her for a blurb and she doesn't even have like a website. So it's like you have to be able to access her agent to get anything to her in the first place. So no, absolutely. I think like for, especially like when we're talking about literary writers, like literary fiction, the more like behind the curtain you can be, I feel like that's kind of a strong brand. And one of my friends, when I told him like, okay, I'm making these TikToks, I'm trying to promote my book, he was like, that's not very literary. And I was like, yeah, but like it's literary to like sell 10 copies, go out of print, and then die in obscurity. So like I'm not gonna try to do that on purpose. But I mean, it's like I would love to have a literary brand, but it's like I'm not there yet. Like maybe I can like update it later on, but for now I'm like doing the commercial thing.
Yeah, you know, we can't all like die in a bath in Paris, like
yeah, exactly.
That's so funny. But yeah, no, that's so true about The other thing that I really like, and I hear this with a lot of, there's a guy who's going to be on a podcast episode that's coming up. He and I are going to do a whole separate podcast about veteran writers and book groups for veterans. But, he was very honest about how much it helped jumpstart his career that he has a retirement from the Marine. And, like James Salter, one of my favorite underrated American novelists, he was in the Air Force full time when he wrote his first couple of books, and then he used his retirement money from that. Or, Elmore Leonard was a copywriter. Ditto Salman Rushdie. I feel like those stories aren't like people sort of fetishize like quitting your day job, but like there's some like the real takeaway seems to be to keep your day job and find a way to write around it.
Yeah, like Don DeLillo, I think, was at an ad agency most of his career.
Mm-hmm.
No, when I say like I really want to get out of commerce journalism for many reasons. My husband like pointed to, we saw a Hopper exhibit at the Whitney last year, and they had all these like Life magazine covers that he had been commissioned to do before he was a big name. And it's like everyone has to like hustle and like grind it out somewhere, making like art that they're not proud of. And I'm calling my commerce journalism articles art is like a huge stretch, but it's like there's something to be said for like the hard skills you learn though.
I think and this is not original to me. This is something Stephen Pressfield, who was on this podcast, said. There's something to be said for writing, and I'm butchering what he said, but basically with copywriting, you learn a lot from writing stuff that people are actively trying to avoid reading.
But you have to like convince them to read it. Definitely.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of the comm stuff that I write is basically copywriting.
I mean, if you're writing clickbait, you're learning how to make people click, which is a real art.
I mean, especially in like this attention economy where it's getting more outrageous every day. That's why, like, if you scroll through my like Reels page, it's the same buzzwords over and over again because I kind of see what works. It's like ultra wealthy, status symbol, like privilege. Like there's certain words that I can tell do well, and I can't like oversaturate it. But like after I have a few flops in a row, I'll be like, let me bring it back.
So there was something we talked about before we got on here, and I still want to get to the Odyssey, and I know we're I want to be aware of your time here, but I don't know what to call this. I think I was in describing it to you. I used the term like the creepy middle, but there seems to be this universal phenomenon, and I want to be really, really careful in how I talk about this because I'm not talking about anyone in particular, and I don't want to make it like. Every time I bring up brunch on this podcast, some friend of mine who I just had brunch with will be like, I didn't know how strongly you felt about brunch. I'm like, no, I had a great time.
Symbolic brunch.
Yes, yeah. So I reached out to you to do this podcast in a DM. You were like, oh, that sounds great. Like, send me the link. And we set it up and we made it happen. And that's been the case with people who are really busy and well-known and well-read and are honestly slumming it by coming on my podcast. But they're whatever. They got there by being available and helpful and sharing. And sometimes people don't want to do it, and that's okay. And then I have friends where, they don't have a platform and maybe they want to be on the podcast, maybe they don't, but it's a simple kind of yes or no. And then there are people who are kind of like moderately successful or like they have a little bit of a platform and they will grill me and be like, well, I would have to know more about this podcast. And like, what are your, they want all kinds of personal questions and what's your audience size? Nobody who has an audience themselves has ever asked me about my audience size. And
that's funny.
But I've seen this phenomenon other places. There are people who are struggling and nice and successful and nice, and in the middle sometimes it's nasty. Is that a thing? Like, what's going on there?
You called it the awful middle when we were talking about it before. And
you're
being
middle.
careful with your words, but I think, I think everyone knows what you're talking about, where it's like maybe this is too reductive, but like I chalk it up to insecurity. And when you're like really successful, it's probably easier to be confident than when you're trapped in that like middle limbo zone is when you have the most self-doubt. And like, I think about it in terms of like people who are easily threatened. And this is like a TikTok that I'm working out right now where there's this thing that I'm calling like the socially required compliment. Like if someone shows you a picture of their baby or like, and this is what happened to me recently, like my agent was showing people pictures of my book cover and like kind of bragging and like it was very sweet. He was like, look, look, look. And there were like these two women who were like, oh, and they couldn't like, you have to, oh, that's so nice. Like you have to say, oh, your baby's so cute. Like even if you don't want to, even if it's like burning you up inside, even if like your friend just got engaged and like you're dying with envy, like you have to say congratulations, like say it through gritted teeth, but it is socially required. And like people who stay on the far side of that and they just like go, oh, like these women who like couldn't like squeeze out that like praise, like they're exemplary of that like awful middle where it's like you're so easily threatened and like you need to constantly assert yourself. And like in asking you like, is your audience big enough for me? Like they're kind of putting on airs and like saying like, I'm doing you a favor, like constantly needing to reinforce like a hierarchy in which they are superior. And like that type of person is really common. Like it's not just in publishing. I think it's like you've got a fragile ego, you've got some self-doubt, you've got insecurities, and we want to be sympathetic to people like that, but I feel like they just exhibit it in this way that is so insufferable that it's like they're asking for criticism.
That makes sense. Colleges, you see it too. I mean, my brother went to Yale, and I can remember his friends are like so nice. Like, and that was the thing, and that was the word that came up a lot when like we had family visiting for his class day or whatever. We're like we've kind of all lived through his academic success in a lot of ways, and so we get like extended family coming to these things, and they were expecting maybe like American Psycho or something, and what they got were these just down to earth kids with nothing to prove, some of whom didn't grow up with every advantage and whatnot.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I feel like the smartest people that I know are sometimes like low key smart, and they're not flexing in your face constantly. So it kind of takes a moment to be like, oh wow, that person is actually the smartest person that I've talked to. And like they don't try to rub it in your face or like prove anything. And that can kind of be like really refreshing when you're used to like the Ivy League Yale stereotype that like in your mind you were expecting. But I think like the funny thing is that it cuts both ways because you don't want to be an Ivy Leaguer apologist, right? Like I feel like a lot of my videos kind of like tread this line finely, and I'm like leaking all my upcoming content, my this thing that I was writing last night, and I was like workshopping it with my husband. Like, okay, you know how it's a thing when you go to an Ivy League, like people will be like, oh, I went to school in Cambridge. Oh, I went to school in New Haven, right? And it's like, oh, this is like so toolish, right? Like, why don't you just say I went to Yale? Okay, so like we all agree that's annoying, but like my contention is that like there's actually a reason that this became a practice, and it's because there are the awful middle who, even if you're asked, if they say, where did you go to school? And you say, oh, I went to Yale. They'll say, oh, you think you're so great? And they'll immediately get bent out of shape because like that is such an attack to them. And like this reality, I think, is what like created that phenomenon. Because it's like, it doesn't really make sense otherwise. It's like, why are you trying to hide it? Because I had like a weird interaction with someone who asked me, where did you go to school? And they went to NYU, like a very good school. They said, where did you go to school? And I said, Penn. And they went, la-di-da. And I'm like, you asked me a question. Right? So it's like, after you have enough of these encounters, I think you kind of like self-censor and you're like, let me not bring up this shockingly provocative subject. Like, I'm just going to like try and hide under like Philly. And I hope that you think dreadful. Like, people are just so, they feel so under attack all the time.
Yeah. It's weird how that goes. I mean, I've seen, again, going back to some of these communities that I'm not a part of, but that I've worked with through ghostwriting. There's a moment, I'm working on a book right now with a lot of first responders involved, and there's an element of like, I'm just going to take a second to figure out are you the kind of person who like is going to put me on a pedestal because of this job or ask me maybe hurtful questions. And once the air is clear and it's obvious that that's not what I'm about, then like we're good.
Interesting. Oh, that's weird. Yeah. Yeah, but it's like, I mean, I think like you said, like in ghostwriting or like anything that's client facing, right? I guess like a patient is client facing, you have to get a read on the person before knowing how to interact with them. Like you actually can't like approach people with a one size fits all like demeanor. It's like when I have a really shy, like diffident student, like I'm a different person than when I have like a very capable, confident student. Like I can give criticism much more freely. Whereas with the other person, I'm just trying to not scare them.
Interesting. God, it's isn't it weird how you like show up to like do a job or help someone with their essay or help them write a book or whatever, and you end up like doing hardcore like social work.
Yeah. No, it actually does feel like that. And kind of like I was listening to an episode of your show and you were talking about how like usually people don't like intend to become ghostwriters. It kind of like happens organically. And like very much the same thing with like anyone that does college essay stuff. Like usually it's struggling writers, to be honest. It's like I have an MFA, like there's no way to monetize this other than this one single field. Like so many writers start like this. And yeah, it's like not something that you even intend to do, but it's like you learn a lot of like people skills along the way.
I don't know that everybody could empathize with a kid who's choosing between a bunch of great schools and is going to be fine. But that's not the emotional truth of like if they're scared talking to you or writing an essay.
Right. I mean, I wonder if you have this problem with ghostwriting though. Like sometimes the biggest problem is that like the student doesn't really have like a worldview or like a take or an opinion that we can channel into the essay. And like that lack of personality, like it's not easy to work with. It's not like, oh, blank slate, like I can impose whatever I want on this. Like it makes it really hard to like manufacture a voice and like some kind of perspective.
It's funny, I always think of like people at that kind of teenage, like the age you are when you're applying to college, when I think of the one type of client I can't work with, no matter how interesting their story is or whatever. And that is someone who gives like one syllable answers. Or says things like, well, you know how it goes. I'm like, well, no, I don't. I'm actually here to learn how it goes. So
Right. This is a lot of high school age kids though. So it's like this is like a tough thing. I don't think I have a great way of dealing with it. And in fact, like I don't think I would be a very good ghostwriter because I think like my stamp is like really big on all the essays that I help write. Like it's hard for me to also like if a voice is like, and like I've been a writer for a long time, so this makes sense. It's like children versus me. Like my voice is just stronger sometimes and it like overpowers. And it's like, okay, if you're not saying something that's better than what I'm proposing, we're going to go with what I'm proposing. So it's like
yes.
And they're like, no, I like how you said it better. Like a lot of times they're like, just like what you said. And I'm like, okay, like it's starting to sound like me though.
My favorite, like I know I did my job and I've had this happen twice where somebody deletes something, like let's say they sent me like source material that they had written, and
I heard you say this on the episode.
Oh, amazing! Yeah, okay, yeah,
because like, you sound more like them or their conception of them than they actually do. But then it's like kind of like an identity thing where it's like, okay, I like figured you out and I mimicked you and you bought it, and like I mean, you should be proud of that.
You are writing a retelling of the Odyssey. You are writing it from Athena's point of view. Mm-hmm. Say more.
It made sense to me that you wanted to talk about this because I saw all of your like kayaking posts. I was like, oh, you're Odysseus. This is just you. Yeah.
I took it as an instruction manual. I don't know what everybody else does.
Yeah. Wait, sidebar before I answer that. Did you ever read The Golden Bough?
No. I'm going to write that down.
It's like Bough. I didn't get through it, but it's sort of like, I feel like it says the same thing that you just said, where it's like all stories are just regurgitating Iliad, Odyssey, and I read it because basically every single writer, like canon writer that I admired, referenced it at some point. And I was like, I've got to read this. But then it was like a little bit too like literary theory for me, and it's really long, but I feel like you might like that. My retelling the Odyssey from Athena's perspective, I read a lot. Like I in school I studied classics. I identify as a classicist. My like love for retellings is still strong, and I'll read like even the really bad ones. Like, and there was such this trend like after Circe. Did you ever read Madeline Miller's Circe?
No, it's been on my list like forever, and that's the one obviously
Really?
that comes to mind with like recent retellings.
Yeah, and like that was fabulous. And then there have been a lot of like copycats. A lot of them are really good, but they kind of follow the same like it's like a very like feminist bent. And it's like you didn't know that all along, like Ariadne was pulling the strings, or like whoever it might be from mythology. And like I like this, but I kind of felt like, okay, this is getting a little bit tired. If I want to write something that's a retelling, I can't push the same buttons. So like in all these things that like my work is also feminist, but I have like a penchant for anti-heroes. So I was like, I want to write like a terrible, like unlikable, bitchy woman. And I think I described it as like the Sopranos-esque, because you get to see like inside her head. And like in the same way that like, okay, Tony's going to Dr. Melfi and you like get his interiority that way. Like I have her basically writing a journal as she's going through each of the obstacles with Odysseus. And like my conceit is that like she's really an elitist and she is an Olympian. So she like really condescends, like looks down on minor gods and thinks mortals are like disgusting. And she unfortunately for her falls in love with Odysseus. So it's like this really like messed up like psychological situation when you're in love with someone that you don't respect. And like a lot of like the parallels I draw, like I thought about this phenomenon where like a lot of white conservative men are married to Asian women. And you just wonder, like, how does that dynamic work? Like, is he racist, but he loves her? Or is it like he doesn't see her as a person and objectify? Like, it's such a bizarre, like, headspace to be in. And that's sort of like what I explore with this relationship where he does not like her back. And so she's like kind of like chasing after him. And that's why she's like on the boat with him all along. And the other like main, I guess, feminist commentary that I kind of include is like she is the goddess of war. Like a lot of her power comes from her proximity to masculinity. And it's like when you think of the female goddesses, like at least I think of her as like the strongest. And she starts to like have this like self-loathing inner dialogue where she's like, where she starts saying to herself, he would like me if I were more feminine, like if I had like more curves, like whatever it may be. But the like ancient story allowed me to comment on like a lot of modern themes, and it's like kind of timely, so I would like to sell it soon. And I have like commentary on, you know, like the anti-natalist movement.
Oh my God, yeah.
Okay. And so like she's a proponent of that, and she's like, oh, it's so annoying that like motherhood excuses you and like elevates you from excuses you from certain things, and like you can be as selfish as you want if you say like, oh, I'm doing this for my kid. And like this is like sometimes like satire, sometimes it's like my actual opinion, like it's all mixed in there. That's the beauty of fiction, I guess. But like Athena is basically saying, yeah, like motherhood is like this exalted status that single women don't get to experience. Virgins are also kind of a Madonna like whore type of complex where like her virginal status and Artemis's virginal status is very held up, but then at the same time they're kind of like whispered behind their backs, like, oh, they're so naive, like they're immortal, but they're still virgins. Like it's kind of like me riffing on all these different topics while they're going on this journey, and like you know how it's going to end. And unlike the actual Odyssey, it's told chronologically. Ooh. So you're not going like flashbacks in time as much, because yeah, I mean, I get why Homer did that, but when I was like trying to parse it out, I was like, I literally like drew out a timeline of like, okay, so he starts with the Lotus Eaters, and then like by the time he gets to Calypso, and then it's Nausicaa at the end, like it's all like jumbled at, so I had to straighten it.
It's wow. Okay, well, I can't wait to read this now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting too. I've always found in the Iliad, especially, and you had mentioned, envy has come up a few times, and resentment, in what we've talked about, and the way, like, even though for the gods, all these things the mortals are going through are kind of like, it's like the Jerry Springer show for them or something. At the same time, they have to contend with the fact that without mortality, their like existence doesn't mean anything.
Yeah,
And
that's like the premise of Circe.
Because that's the thing too, where it's like, yeah, and weirdly, like, then you can almost elevate war dead above the gods because they've, paid this sacrifice to play a game that the gods could never understand. It's
so I think that's like a common, maybe it was like also in the Orwell book that you mentioned about like when academics seem to defend the poor, or like, have you ever seen Barton Fink?
Oh yeah, long time ago.
Brothers movie, right?
Yeah.
Like I think that movie's so funny, and it's sort of like this fetishization of like the whatever the underclass is, and in my book it's like mortals, but it's like you think you're so much better than them, but there are certain things that like it's like you really envy, like loving someone so much that when they die you feel that level of grief. Like Athena like kind of goes on a rant where it's like I will never get to experience that because everyone I know is immortal and everyone that I care about is immortal. But yeah, it was like fun to write like a really like nasty, mean voice. That's what I liked.
I love that. And in a way, like, I mean, her omniscience. I feel like there's so much you could do with that because he's having to contend with storms and all these things that are quite literally over his head. And not to mention what's going on in his brain, but she can kind of puppeteer. But also, like, the thing I've always found interesting about the Odyssey in like modern, almost like I'd put it in like recovery parlance of like, there's so much going on in that book codependency wise, and like, you've got Penelope waiting for this guy who is on his like self-medication journey of and is like probably one of the most emotionally unavailable characters in literary history. But like that also seems to weirdly be the appeal.
I feel like is he an anti-hero or is he a regular hero? Like there's not really a straight answer to that. And like one of the challenges I suppose that I like give him on top of the actual monsters is like he's debating like, should I like sort of be a sugar baby and like engage in this relationship with this goddess who's like willing to give me anything I want if I like pretend to be in a relationship with her? And it's like, what kind of integrity do you hold on to? And like, if your survival is at stake, like maybe you just give into it.
Oh man, there's a word and I'm gonna blank on it, but it's called I think it's like the Odysseus phenomenon or the Odysseus factor or something like that. But it was observed by there's this wonderful book, and you had mentioned sailing earlier, and even if you don't sail, everyone should read this book. It's called A Voyage for Madmen, and it's about the first solo circumnavigation of the world without touching land, which happened a few months before the moon landing, to give you an idea of how difficult it is to sail around the world solo. And there was this one French guy, Bernard Moitessier, who, and I tell this as a roundabout defense of being compared to Odysseus, which I think is one of those things like Kurt Cobain. It's cool when you're younger and it's pathetic when you're older. This guy Moitessier was in the lead, and when he got to approaching Africa the second time, where he would then turn left and head back to England, he decided to just keep sailing. And he wrote a book. I think it's called The Long Way Around or something. It's excellent. He was like this globe-trotting, sailing bohemian. And so he was like, getting to the finish line to me would be like sailing from nowhere to nowhere. And he, by the way, had a family and just sort of like left them to go to Fiji, and he kept going around the world for like a while. But they talked in this book about this Odysseus phenomenon where the life of someone like that can be inspiring to people who like are never going to do something like that, but can kind of weirdly benefit from his doing it.
You mean like by living vicariously through him?
Yeah. Or even, through the example, or maybe like the Odyssey.
I mean, that's one way of looking at it, but when you say that, it makes me think of like Apocalypse Now and like these guys that keep, like, they come home and they're so maladjusted that they sign up for another tour. And it's like, yeah, on one hand, it's like, okay, you see how they're like continuing the adventure, but on another hand, it's like they're not dealing with the trauma. And it's like there's like an epilogue to the Odyssey. And like now I don't know if I read it in like one of these fan fiction type of books, right? Like the canon mythology and then like the modern taste like get kind of like mixed in my head. But isn't it like when Odysseus gets home, he doesn't adjust well and he always like, he goes on one more adventure and he hates his son. Like, isn't that part of the real canon? And I was like, yeah, that makes sense because it's like that heightened state for so many years. Like you get addicted to like the adrenaline or whatever. And then it's like you go home and it's boring and you're just dissatisfied.
I think that's right. I know what you're talking about. And I'm not current enough with my lore to know whether that was.
No, it's funny because like my friend wrote a play about like Achilles on Skyros, and then when we were like workshopping it and I was giving my comments, we were talking about like, well, in the real myth, in the real this, and it's like all of this is fictional. So like, what are we talking about as like the referent real? But I do get like nitpicky about that because I saw this annoying post on Instagram where it's like these quotes that are just made to look like very like poetic and pretty, and it was a quote from Homer, but it was actually a quote from Troy. Right? It was like
Troy,
the Brad Pitt. Yeah. Yes, it was like a line that Achilles says like, the gods envy us because like our lives are more beautiful because we can die. And then it was like Homer, and I was like, Homer did not say that.
Yeah, there's no way. Oh, yeah, misattributing quotes. That's like a whole other God. And you mentioned The Sopranos. I won't even go there because that like will be here a long while.
Did you watch the David Chase documentary?
Not yet.
That came out recently?
Not yet. I'm so excited. My wife and I rewatched all of The Sopranos recently.
That documentary made me want to rewatch the series. Like, to me, the big takeaway though was like that writer's room was basically David Chase asked everyone like for their personal stories, and then he just put it in the show.
Amazing.
And that's why it's good. That's why it feels so real.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's really yeah, anyway, we could be here a while if we got into The Sopranos. I cannot wait to watch that. So question I like to ask everybody is like the last question. Is there anything I didn't ask about that you wanted to talk about?
I mean, we covered a lot of ground.
We did.
I mean, I feel like I gave an unsatisfactory answer to your sort of like main first question about like navigating the relationship with a client when it's like someone who's tremendously rich. But I think in a way, like my real answer would be a non-answer, where it's like you have to read each person individually. And we talked about this so much, but I do think that like a lot of what I do as a fiction writer is like you kind of cut to the heart of people's insecurities right away. And then that is kind of like the narrative you construct around them. And I don't think that's accurate per se. I think that's very much like a fiction tool. But I think when you're working with someone and you have to get to know them quickly, it is a useful shorthand. So it's like I have some students who I can tell like they think of me as the help, you know? Like I'm the hired help. And then there's other students who like think I'm so smart and like whatever I say, they want it to go in the essay. And it's like, those are all the things you sort of have to like read under the surface as you're having like the normal consult conversation with them.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Yeah, I'm even thinking of, and it never, again, going back to the sort of awful middle, there is no rhyme or reason to who is going to do each of those things. I've had people who have all the time in the world because they're retired treat me like they're doing me a favor by showing up to a scheduled interview. And then I've had CEOs let me know how happy they are to not be on another stupid, stand up. And there's so much they like this is their priority, writing a book.
Will you ever do a book about ghostwriting?
I don't know. There's one out there that's so good that I don't know if anything else needs to be said. And it's called The Man Who Hacked the World, by Alex Cody Foster. And it's about he was McAfee's ghostwriter until they fired each other.
Each other. It was mutual.
Yes, but I mean, you see why. It as you read it, it's a crazy story. And if you're into like tech industry lore at all, it's a good one. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I really there was this amazing, and he comes up a lot on this podcast because of Cape Cod and because I like this writer. But Sebastian Junger he did one of those New York Times. What do they call it? The Book Times, Books of the Times, or it's like the interviews with authors and stuff.
Okay.
What do they call it? And they usually have like a illustration of the person's face. And somebody asked like, who would you want to write your biography? And he's like, I'm not important enough to have a biography. A New York Times obit would be fine. And
That's so funny.
I don't know. Like, I hope that my career is kind of like a good voyage where it's like exciting, or an expedition. It's like exciting and there's thrilling moments, but it's uneventful. And like, there's actually nothing worth talking about because it all went well.
Achilles is offered like short, brief life and like eternal fame, or like long life with happiness and obscurity. So you pick the latter.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. I don't. Yeah. And it's it's up to the Atlantic Ocean whether I get that, I think. But I don't. Yeah. I don't know. I think to me, like, ghostwriting is something I came to as a maturing of my ambitions and being just sort of realistic about where my talent lies. And it's, ghostwriting is mostly interviewing. And it's like, it's just in the same way with sports. Like, some people are sprinters, some people are endurance athletes, and you only have so much say in kind of which one you are. And I don't know. Yeah, I don't know that I'm smart enough or creative enough. And I'm not saying that ghostwriting is like some second rate whatever. It's just that I'm not as good at writing as I am at interviewing and listening.
No, it's a totally different skill set. Like, I think people don't understand, like, just talking to someone, getting the information out of them is not really enough. And like, this is what I feel so much when I have like these monosyllabic students, and it's like, okay, we're trying to tell your whole life story and you're not giving me anything.
Yeah. And sometimes you have to be the kind of person who knows how to ask a very uncomfortable question and then just like let it sit there.
Yeah.
Because unless that student is a psychopath, they will fill that silence with something, and it'll usually be like, no, I'm seriously. Some people don't have feelings, and it's not going to register that you're making it awkward on purpose. But yeah, I don't know, and I guess there is something else there that I think is important, and I think would kind of fit into one of your takedowns of a phenomenon. When you ask people about ghostwriting in a generic, like, career day kind of way, like especially on Reddit, you'll see this, or like I'm talking like open forums where there's lots of different people. One of the most common reactions, people get very like almost angry, and they're like, how could you be okay with not getting credit for your writing, or like, why would you put your creativity towards something that someone else gets credit for? Or how can you sleep at night knowing that this celebrity says that they wrote a book or whatever? And I think if those are coming from an honest place, I think those are legitimate questions. And maybe ghostwriting isn't for you if you're not comfortable with the answer being like, I don't get credit and I like it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if does that make sense?
I mean, like, okay, I relate to it on the level of like, there's certain things like comm journalism that I don't want credit for. Like, I had to write this whole essay about the toilet paper that the royals use. And I was like, does my name have to be on this article? Because it's like embarrassing. But then, yeah, I mean, not to sound like a broken record, but like when people ask those really like loaded questions, it says more about them and their own psyche and their own insecurities than maybe about like you and credit and ghostwriting. Like you said, from an honest place, like some of those questions are good questions, but when you have so much like anger about like just the thought of ghostwriting, like this person has not gotten credit for something that they wish they did in some other arena of their life. Is like what I would kind of like armchair diagnose them as.
Totally. That's a really, really good point. I think that's true. And then even maybe just a misunderstanding about what writing is, what it looks like. You know, I would imagine some of those same people fantasize about like book launch parties and salons that don't exist anymore.
Yes. That's such a well, because okay, their gripe is credit, right? Like it's like they have maybe a legitimate, maybe a exaggerated obsession with like getting credit. And like that's why I find like certain writers who seem to be in it for the fame like very off-putting, because it's like this is not a very smart or strategic way to get famous. This is like one of the hardest ways to get famous. So I'm like, you think that writing this book and hoping that it becomes a series and hoping that it gets made into a movie, like that's not like there's faster ways to get famous. There's easier things you could do to get famous. But yeah, like the book launch parties, the boost for a boost culture is gross. Where it's like, okay, everyone, I put this on my Instagram, like please go comment, engage with it, and like next time you post, I'll do the same for you. Like I find that to be distasteful.
I mean, it goes back to how I think about this podcast is there is no goal. Like this is a place to have random conversations.
I feel like that's the only
people.
way you can do something like with your whole heart. Like if I think about it too much, like I get really angry about the time that I've spent making the TikTok reels and stuff. And like, luckily a handful of good things have come out of it, like talking to you. Like that would never have happened otherwise. But I'm like, everything, like all I want to do is be a novelist. Like I already have my next like 5 books, like four of them I have in draft form. And like, I know what the 5th one's going to be. And like, all I want to do is write them. And every hour that I spend like making TikToks or like looking at the analytics to see what's doing well, I'm like, this is ancillary to what I actually want to do, along with writing essays with kids, along with commerce journalism. I'm like, when am I going to get to do what I want to do? But it's like that's the like gold at the end of the rainbow, and it's far away.
I don't know, maybe not that far. I can't imagine the retelling of the Odyssey isn't going to be like a runaway. It's a surprise.
See, but you're my audience.
Hit.
That's so funny. You're sweet, but yeah, I wish people felt like that. But I've heard that the retelling of Greek myths is very saturated, and I got a couple editors' feedback that said like, we are tired of like Western mythology. Do you have? And I don't know if they're asking that because it's me. Like, do you have any Eastern mythology? And I was like, I studied Latin and Greek in college. I didn't study like Eastern stuff, but maybe I can whip something up for you. Like, I don't know.
Hates it. Oh my God, that's bad.
But it's like this, I don't know, that's their version of like correcting. Like, we're just going to say no to Greek myth. But I'm like, this is not the standard retelling. Like, I'm trying to do something different. Who's to say if I'm succeeding? But we'll see. I would like for it to like see the light of day. But you know what? Like the road is so long. This book that I'm finally publishing in April, I started it in 2016.
Whoa.
And it took me like, I had shelved it actually. I'd shelved it and then I sent out a cold email to an editor at this press, and that's how I got my deal. So, like, not standard at all. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to go through an agent, but I didn't have an agent at the time, so I was like, let me just try this.
Love it.
You have to be scrappy. Like, that's the quality that I had to learn, like, post-rich kid phase, to be honest. Like, I was very good at, like, following rules and, like, high achieving in, like, the standard sense, but it's, like, it took, like, rejection, MFA, having my book on the back burner for a long time to be like, all right, what am I going to do to make this happen?
Yeah, I think that's great advice, though, for anyone because I think sometimes when people ask, and again, like I'm assuming someone's coming from an honest place, but when they say, how did you get published? How did you get your book deal? How did you get your agent? Sometimes what they're really saying is, give me the hack or the shortcut.
Yeah. No, and it's like a funny outlook because I saw like I don't really read the comments in my content because they're usually like pretty bad. But once in a while, I'll see something that's nice. And this person posted like, what do you read and what do you watch to get like, I love your opinions. Where do you get them from? And it was like kind of demonstrative, like this idea that like I'm getting my opinions from somewhere and then like broadcasting them out. And like I never responded to the comments, so I didn't say anything. But I was like, this mentality is kind of like the cultural problem right now. Like you think you can like, hey, and then have opinions. And like in this TikTok workshop that I'm teaching, like I like open it up to like, this is not like do this and you'll become a successful influencer. It's like part of it is deciding like, does this make sense for your content, like the subject matter of your book and your personality? Because like if you can't, like I'm like giving you a specific formula, it's not a one size fits all. It's like I'm kind of showing you how to replicate what I did, which is like sometimes you have to be like a little controversial, you have to be willing to be clickbaity, and if you're not willing to do those things, then like this is not the class for you. Like it's kind of a very prescriptive, like this is my method, and I'm certainly not saying it works for everyone or is even appealing to everyone.
It's really, again, and it gets in, like, there's so many layers to what's going on by people's reaction to these things, but it's funny how there are people who want these things, but in a very vague way, because they just like, maybe even the vibe that you're putting out, like, you seem happy doing what you're doing, and how do I get happy?
Right, like, people look at something, and, like, maybe you make it look easy, so they're like, it's easy. But I do feel like that, like, because so many, like, highly skilled professions or whatever it may be are visible in social media these days, it does kind of like make them seem easier than they actually are. And I don't think that's a good thing.
No.
Like there's also like an entitlement, I think that's linked in it also, because I do get a lot of messages like after I had these college essay TikToks that will be like, hey, I can't afford you, but can you do it for free? And it's like, this is a bit like, this is not my passion project at all. This is like my side hustle. This is my business. Like the second I can drop this, I'm going to drop this. But it's like, whatever. I just ignore those messages. But I do feel like there's kind of this like, shoot your shot. Why not ask? And it's like, because it's rude. Like it's actually pretty rude to lowball someone like that. Or like say, I can't afford this, but like maybe you just want to do a good deed. And like kind of like, I don't know, like latch on to like, oh, I'm doing something that is like vaguely elitist. And I should feel some kind of guilt, so I should like compensate. It's like I don't have enough hours to like do all of my side hustles and write my book. But and it's like shoot your shot. I don't know.
Oh man, yeah. No, that's a thing. I've definitely taken a couple of those calls.
Okay, and you didn't know beforehand?
Yeah, I've learned how to ask the right follow-up questions to keep those from becoming phone calls. And so far it's been okay.
Yeah.
Oh man.
But it is something you have to learn, right? Like there's certain pitfalls that like when you basically running our own business, you have to have a bad experience of some mom who was trying to not pay her bill. And then I had to chase her. And then I was like, okay, from now on, I'm taking a deposit at the beginning, which I wasn't doing before.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. Everybody write that down. Well, Sanibel, I'm really glad I reached out. Thank you so much for doing this. I know we ran way over time, but I think this is like there have been some awesome rabbit holes and digressions here.
No, thank you so much for having me. It was so fun talking to you. That flew by. We didn't get to Nantucket. I realized that's a whole different arena. But...
Yeah, I'd be up for like a bonus episode, especially if you're down to like talk about like whaling lore and like sea shanties and all that kind of stuff.
And not my expertise. I read Moby Dick in my MFA, but it's probably the extent of it.
I seriously would love to do, and I actually have a friend who is a writer and has spent a lot of time on Nantucket, and if she'd be up to do the podcast, I'd love to have like a Cape and Islands bonus episode.
I love that idea.
And my buddy Josh was on the podcast. He's someone who like his like healing from coming home from war was very much reconnecting with the Cape, like the outdoors and the nature there through the literature of wildlife on the Cape. And it's, yeah, powerful place. Well, Sanibel, thanks again. I will include links for everybody to find you, and good luck with the workshop.
Thank you. I appreciate that a lot. It was great talking to you.
Thanks again. If you have an epic story, I'd love to hear it. You can find me at dailyprose.com or on LinkedIn. My links and Sanibel's are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.